Good evening, everyone. Trust you all well. Just waiting for a few more people to join us. Had some technical issues, that's why we're running a bit late. But good evening to everyone. Tonight, in the Burst of Inspiration, very briefly, I'd like to share with you a bit of insight in regards to the fast that we have tomorrow morning. Yes, it is the fast of Tevet, Asara B'Tevet. One understand why it is so significant, and then a bit of insight into the rivalry, the jealousy, and the reconciliation between Judah and Joseph and the rest of the brothers. So let's make a start with the 10th of Tevet very briefly. So it's perhaps one of the most underrated fasts, if I could say such a thing. What do I mean? Well, most people, if I ask you, what is the 10th of Tevet about? Okay, well, what you tell me, what is the 10th of Tevet about? Most people will say, I haven't got the foggiest, don't know, short fast, and that's it. 10th of Tevet was the fast which, let me just tell you its significance. It is unique to fast on a Friday. And in fact, our sages tell us that were it to be that the 10th of Teves would fall on Shabbat, we would also fast on the 10th. We would fast on the Shabbat. So the question is obvious. Why is it that the 10th of Teves is so significant that it would, as it were, outdo or override the Shabbat? We only find, even Tisha B'Av, we don't fast on Shabbat. Why is it that we would find Asara B'Tevet, the 10th of Tevet, we will be fasting tomorrow on a Friday, going into Shabbat, and where it's full on a Shabbat, we would fast, even on Shabbat. Let's go back in history and understand what the 10th of Tevet is all about. And the answer is that it really is the beginning. It's the time where there was the siege by Nebuchadnezzar of Jerusalem, and it was really when the beginning of the end was there to be seen. So what is significant is, despite the fact that it seemed at the time, okay, there's a siege, but it got much worse, and eventually it led to the destruction. Yet this moment in time, says the Chasam Sofer, is perhaps one of the most significant, and that is because everything that came afterwards, everything that followed, everything that unraveled, started here and now. In other words, the way that the Jews responded or chose not to respond was the key for the eventual destruction of the temple. So what do I mean? Good evening. Sorry, apologies. I've been rather rude. Carol, Pal, Harry, and everyone else. Lords, ladies, rebbitzins, rabbis, and everyone else, being serious for a moment. So let's go back and try and understand again. So what we are saying is that this was the forerunner. This laid the path for the eventual destruction of the temple. And although eventually the destruction of the temple was far more profound, far more significant, yet we can trace back the origins, the roots of the destruction to the 10th of Teves. And why? What exactly are the origins? The origins are quite simple. When somebody points out that something is wrong, that you have made a mistake, that you've erred, they give you some criticism, they hold a mirror up to you. How do we naturally, instinctively respond? Invariably, the way that we respond is complete denial. I'm not talking about the river. Complete denial. We say to ourselves, Harry, we'll get through this. It's nothing. We should forget about it. It's not a big deal. It's one of those things. We don't stop to ask questions of ourselves. And therefore, that is the greatest mistake that we as human beings can make. When we live with a cognitive dissonance and refuse to acknowledge and to accept our own shortcomings and failings. That is the lesson of the 10th of Teves. It's so significant, so profound, so timeless that it even can fall on a Shabbat. Even in our day and age, it can fall on a Friday. And therefore, it tells us such an important lesson. When you find that you are being told that you have done something wrong, that there's a criticism, that there's somebody's highlighting a failing, don't overlook it. Don't brush it under the carpet, because you are sowing the seeds of your own self-destruction. The Jewish people had listened, had learnt from their experience of the 10th of Teves, when the siege when the siege commenced around Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. You know what could have happened? It could have ended. It could have been, they could have done teshuvah, repentance, and they could have turned things around. The successful people in life, friends, the successful people in life are not those that don't make mistakes. There are those that make mistakes but are willing to learn and acknowledge where they have gone wrong. Lesson number one. Lesson number two, a not dissimilar one. Firstly, it follows on beautifully, and that is, let me find the Chumash where it's gone. We follow on the great, perhaps the climax in the Joseph brothers rivalry and story. This week's parsha, we find that Benjamin was held. They haven't recognized the viceroy of Egypt being their own brother, their own flesh and blood. Joseph has planted a goblet of money in the sack of his younger brother Benjamin, and therefore he is holding him hostage. Judah steps forward at this moment in time, and he decides that he feels a responsibility to deal with the situation and to bring back, as he had promised Jacob his father, to bring back Benjamin to his father alive and well. And he is going to move heavens and earth to do just that. Let's analyze a glaring inconsistency that is pointed out. We find on the one hand that Judah seems to be rather appeasing, rather conciliatory in his approach towards Joseph, the viceroy of Egypt. Initially, he tries to skirt around the issue, try to find a way to ask him to have mercy, to be kind, to have compassion. And then we see that something changes. And all of a sudden, we see a very hard-nosed Judah, an aggressive Judah. We'll see it inside in a minute. But let's just have a look at the Orach Chaim. So the question is, what changed? That's the question of the Orach Chaim. Judah starts off on path A and then switches to path B. Why is it when he's facing the viceroy of Egypt, he doesn't carry on trying to placate him? What changed? Asks the Orach Chaim. And he answers majestically. He says, you know what changed? That Judah thought back, and he thought back to many, many years before, when there was this instance, similar situation of the selling of Joseph, right? And what does he say? He says to himself initially that Aval Hashemim anachnu, that's what the brothers said, we must be guilty. They felt that if you're going through something, if we're experiencing something, it must all be from God. Exactly the point that we just made with the 10th of Tevet. The brothers initially said, we must be guilty. We're responsible. We're culpable for what we have done wrong. If we are going through something, there's a reason for it. Ein din below dayan. There's no judgment without a judge. And therefore, they felt responsible, and therefore they were going to make a U-turn and take responsibility and do teshuvah. And Judah goes along with this. And then all of a sudden he thinks to himself, says the Orach Chaim. Joseph says to him, it's okay, Judah. You can go home with your brothers, but the young boy, Benjamin, he stays with me because of what he did. And that is what makes Judah snap, according to the Orach Chaim. What does he say? He says, hold on 1 minute. if this whole thing that we are going through, this ordeal, is all because, you know why? Because of what we did to Joseph. Benjamin wasn't around at the time of the selling of Joseph. So it can't be the fact that we are seeing Benjamin suffering. It can't be anything to do with the past. It can't be because of our guilt of the past. And therefore, he decides to go on the offensive. He decides to go for the jugular. That is the approach of the Or HaChaim. In other words, he found an excuse, a justification for not acknowledging and accepting any wrongdoing. Exactly the point that we just made with the fast of Tevet, which is why it is so significant, because we all make mistakes. The question is, are we prepared to move on, or are we going to learn from our mistakes? We live with the past, friends. We don't live in the past. Idea number 2, similar lines, but a slightly different take. It was in the weekly insights this week, and that is as follows. The verses themselves clearly show a placating Judah, as we already mentioned. If you please, my Lord, may your servant speak a word in my Lord's ears, and let not your anger flare up at your servant, for you are like Pharaoh, praising him, appeasing him, right? And Neville Chamberlain. Oh, Harry likes that. Then what happens? Let me read you the Bereshis Rabbah, okay? The Bereshis Rabbah says as follows. And we see in the Bereshis Rabbah, in other words, in the Midrashic sources, a complete change. We see a different, like a Jekyll and Hyde, a completely different Judah. Somebody is really going to go for the jugular, who's going to take out, is prepared to destroy and to decimate Egypt for the sake of Benjamin. He goes on the offensive. Let's have a look, and then we'll explain in a beautiful way. Nechama Leibovich, some of you may have heard of, she passed away a number of years ago, has a beautiful approach based on the sages' sources. So it says as follows. Now, therefore, please let your remain, just stay with this idea. Let your servant remain instead of the youth, right? So in Bereshit Rabbah, he says, you have meted out a perverse judgment on us, Judah says, accusing Joseph. He goes on to say, the fire of Shechem burns within me. Joseph is, of course, this is like an incendiary device, says the fire of your daughter-in-law Tamar. It is, shall I douse it? In other words, he's criticizing Judah for his past misdeeds with Tamar. Judah then says, I shall go forth and dye all the markets of Egypt in blood. And it goes on for pages. In other words, what do we see? We see in the Medrash and the rabbinic exegesis a different side to Judah's personality. Judah is not interested in appeasement. He's not interested in conciliation. He's interested in attack. Why? And Nechama Leibovich points out it's very difficult for us to say that this whole thing, this was actually said. It was a real conversation between Joseph and Judah, because there are things there that the viceroy of Egypt would never have said whilst he is the viceroy of Egypt, right? He wouldn't know about Tamar. He would never say that. That would give away the game, right? So therefore, the Nechama Leibovich comes on to say that, in fact, the statement in the rabbinic exegesis, which is an offensive conversation, is no less than the inner voice of Judah. Judah is saying one thing to the Pharaoh of Egypt, but we are learning through the Medrash, through the rabbinic sources, what he's actually thinking. The inner voice of Judah, the conscience of Judah, how Judah feels inside. And of course, outwardly, he's got to go through the motions. He's got to be conciliatory. He's got to be appeasing. He's got to be placating. He's got to be pragmatic. He's got to try everything to bow and to scrape in order to be able to get back Benjamin. But inside, he's berating himself over how he behaved. He's criticizing himself. Look at the way, as he is going through the motions with Benjamin, he's saying, why is it I'm doing this for Benjamin and I never did it for Joseph? If I did it for Joseph, he'd still be alive. In other words, we see a Judah that is living at this moment in the past. He's trying to make peace with the inner conflict that he's facing. A conflict between now Judah, Judah the new, Judah that is rehabilitated and reformed, and Judah of old, which he's still gnawing away inside him. How could I have done that to my brother Joseph? There are things that have happened to each and every one of us in our past, things that we feel, things that we remember, voices that we hear. Why didn't I? Why did I? How could I have allowed it to happen? You read the memoirs of many a prime minister, and you'll see that so often they have such regrets that they live with it for generations, that they live in the past. This is what happened with Judah. And eventually Judah is able to put it to bed. It takes, of course, the reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers, but eventually Judah is able to move on. But the lesson, this that when I learned these sources, friends, I have to tell you that it was like a bolt between the eyes. It really was. For the way that we are meant to, the way we as people are meant to develop, to mature, not living with a cognitive dissonance, but living with that past, being accepting, being good to ourselves. How mean, how harsh are we with ourselves? Some people are not. Some people, it's a complete airbrushing, whitewashing. They don't think anything of the past. They don't want to think about it. I want to keep moving. I want to live a very fast life. That's why it's so hard for them at the moment, so that I don't have to think about anything. But there are others, friends, that are. I know somebody, and the whole of their lives, the rest of their lives, they were just eaten up with remorse, with guilt. They were guilt ridden to their very core, and they never made peace with themselves. And it is such an illness. It ruins your lives. You become frozen in time. The lesson that we see from Judah, and with this we'll conclude, is that a person has to be true and real with themselves, accept our faults, accept our misdeeds, and be prepared to move on, to draw a line, to learn from the past, to make peace, and to be able to live with a emboldened, enriched experience based on our past, so that we are able to learn from it and move into a new future. We don't know, Harry. We don't know. In answer to your question about Neville Chamberlain, was he bothered or not bothered? I think that deep down, again, many people will put on a brave face publicly, but I'm sure sooner or later he had questions of whether it was the right policy or the wrong policy. I'm sure you think about Roosevelt and all the others, the atom bomb, many questions people have had over the years as to the decisions that they made. And of course, these were dealing with presidents and prime ministers. But each and every one of us, we have these questions that we ask of ourselves. We're real people, we're mature people, we're thinking people, we're growing people. You have to be prepared, though, to draw that line, to say, I've learned from it, I've made amends for it, I've done what I can, and now I move forward. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom. If you're fasting, fast well. If not, don't worry about it. Just keep going, keep growing, do your very best, and look forward to seeing you very soon. It's Nitternacht, and we're learning. Take care. All the best.